guest speakers, we will give 15 minutes for their introductions. After that, we will give a short, let's say, feedbacks, possibilities, and after that, we will open the floor also to you, the audience, so that you can pose questions. As said, without any further ado, I suggest we start with the authors of the book. So, Professor Matej Aubel, maybe we start with you.
Thank you very much, Gorazd, for this invitation, for chairing today's session, for being a co-author with us on this book. It's a great honor to be here in this Zoom forum. As you say, the times are unusual, but we are now reaping some benefits also from those unusual times, since thanks to those times we were able to gather today really outstanding speakers, our dear colleagues and friends who otherwise wouldn't have been able to come to Ljubljana at this point of time. So I'm really happy to be participating in this debate. I was thinking how to introduce this talk today, what to say in terms of introducing the book that we have been working on in the last 3 or so years and was recently published. And when I was cycling here to the university, it occurred to me that I could start with a quote of Tyrion Lannister. I'm not sure if that everyone among you know who Tyrion Lannister is. Neither did I until I spent 3 months under the lockdown and I exposed myself to the Game of Thrones. And as the Game of Thrones end in their very last session, Tyrion Lannister comes up with a question. And he asks, do you know what really unites people? And then he goes on saying, is it armies? Is it gold? Is it flags? No. What really unites people is stories. There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it. So this was Tyrion Lannister. And as I was thinking about Tyrion Lannister, it occurred to me that it was also part and parcel of our endeavor in writing this book to tell a story. And this book that we have written tells a story about Slovenia in the context of the processes of European integration. 2 processes of European integration have been going on in the last 30 years. One is the process of integrating in the Council of Europe, where the bedrock is, of course, the Convention on the Fundamental Rights, European Convention on the Fundamental Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. And the other integration is, of course, the integration in the European Union. And something has happened, at least in the last 10 years, that required to tell a story. Also a story about Slovenia. What has happened in these 10 years is that we have witnessed a process of constitutional backsliding, a process of constitutional decay taking place in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So we wanted to contextualize the Slovenian case study in this context, and we wanted to tell a story. But as an academic, you cannot tell a whatsoever story. You have to tell a good academic story. A good academic story is the one that lives up to certain academic standards. It must be accurate in its description. It must be persuasive in its analysis, and it must be appealing in its normative guidance. So as we have told this story, it has to be taken into account, of course, that this is, once more, of course, our story. The way the authors of this book see this and have experienced the social reality in the country of Slovenia being contextualized in the process of European integration in the last 30 years. It also needs to be made explicit here that the authors of this book belong to a generation which was born and raised in the new Europe. That is in the new Europe of Václav Havel, of Jože Pučnik, the dissidents of the like, that with their lives believed that constitutional democracy is not just a good thing, but that actually a constitutional democracy is the right thing. And that we as a young generation, we also believed that constitutional democracy cannot exist just on books. It cannot be just a paper concept. It cannot exist just on paper, but it has to be translated as much as possible also in the actual reality out there. So as we were approaching this story about Slovenia, we encountered another formidable challenge. It turned out that it's actually very hard to tell a story about Slovenia. It was very hard to tell a story about Slovenia in terms of constitutional backsliding, because Slovenia has been always portrayed as the best disciple of Europe in the New Europe. Slovenia has been portrayed as a role model of the new Europe. Slovenia has been portrayed as a role model for everyone else that wants to join Europe in the forthcoming years and decades. So this story was to a certain extent preempted, and it was only possible to tell this story as other stories, and not just stories but realities, started popping up since 2010, first with the constitutional backsliding in Hungary, still ongoing, and later on as another government in Poland created the Budapest in Warsaw over the last 5 years. So these other developments in other parts of Central Europe also open up a possibility, an opportunity of telling the story, of explaining the case study of Slovenia in this context. Now, the question that we wanted to raise today for today's session was about the many different phases of constitutional backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe. I assume, it is my academic assessment, that indeed there is such a process going on, but this process have different phases in different countries of Central and Eastern Europe. In Hungary, to initiate a process of constitutional backsliding, a particular political party had to win a landslide. It won a constitutional majority. It through that changed the constitution, and it through that captured the state with all its subsystems and also civil society. That was the Hungarian scenario, which has now become the new normal. In Poland, as Wojciech Sadurski writes in one of his works, the situation there was both milder and graver than in Hungary. I quote, "It was milder because the illiberal changes are not constitutionally entrenched, and graver because it involved a systemic set of actions that violate binding constitutional law. These, like in the Hungarian case, also stretch," end of quote, "also stretch to the control of the public media and politicization of the civil service. In so doing, the existing Polish constitution was, while formally untouched, it has been de facto transformed." So, against these two scenarios of Hungary and Poland, what is the hypothesis that we make about Slovenia? The hypothesis, which grows of our personal experience in living in this country about Slovenia, is that in fact, nothing what has been going on in Hungary and Poland over the last 10 years, it is not necessary to be taking place in Slovenia. Our argument, namely, is that what has been going on now in Hungary and Poland, it has been always part and parcel of the Slovenian daily practice. So the argument is that in Slovenia, there is no need to create a constitutional capture. There is no need to capture the state, because from the very beginning of the transition period, de facto, the structures especially the informal structures of the state and the society were in the hands of designated social forces. So the kind of constitutional decay that we are witnessing in Slovenia, and that becomes visible especially when the output legitimacy runs out, that is in the context of economic crisis, the kind of the constitutional decay that we can witness in Slovenia can be described as the status quo. So in order to perpetrate the unhappy constitutional situation in Slovenia, the status quo has to be preserved. And this status quo requires the formal institutions of the state to be weak. It requires the political parties to be weak, to be essentially imploded, and it requires the civil society, the loyal civil society, to be bought, to be purchased, to be funded by those in power in order to sustain this status quo. So this is the underlying hypothesis of this book, which in a certain sense provocatively argues that the situation in Slovenia is even worse than being experienced in Hungary and Poland. And I will stop here, and I think this leaves a lot of room for a discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Aubel, for this introduction and telling the story about the new Europe and also other things which you pointed out. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Jernej Letnar-Černić to provide his view on the book and maybe some conclusions about the book. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be in this panel, and sincere thanks to Bojan, Gabor, and Wojciech, and also Gorazd for joining myself and Matej in this panel, in this book launch of our recent book on the impact of European institutions on the rule of law and democracy in Slovenia and beyond. And as Matej already mentioned, this book grows from a personal experience. Myself, I was born in communist Slovenia when it was still part of former Socialist Yugoslavia, and I witnessed as a young person how tides of justice turned with the fall of Iron Curtain, how first democratic elections were held in Slovenia in April 1990, how the independent Slovenia was reached a year later in June 91. And then when I started the law school in the second half in the 90s, we observed firsthand the normative project of making of constitutional democracy and rule of law in Slovenia. We observed how the first mandate of Slovenian Constitutional Court tried to reform democracy and rule of law, how to try to break from the previous authoritarian, totalitarian system. And the main objective, the point of this book, from the perspective of how European institutions influence the rule of law and democracy in Slovenia, is that those normative safeguards which were introduced in the first decade after Slovenian independence have still not been internalized and employed in practice of Slovenian society. And our book is an example of very critical analysis of the shortcomings of Slovenian constitutional democracy, its institutions, and also applications of the rule of law in the daily practice. And in this regard, if you allow me, I could briefly sketch the contents of our book. In our book, basically, we address the themes such as historical reasons for failures of rule of law in Slovenia. Then we move on to the question of non-reforms of Slovenian economy. This is a chapter which was written by Gorazd. And then we also discuss how human rights protection and the rule of law and democracy in Slovenia are defended and protected mainly depending on the side of ideological spectrum one finds himself in Slovenia. For example, in Slovenia we have several civil society organizations which would defend certain human rights, but then which would turn a blind eye to other human rights violations. And then a large part of our group is very critical account of the functioning of Slovenian judiciary and the rule of law in Slovenia. We are quite critical as to the application of right to fair trial, right to impartial and independent tribunal before the Slovenian ordinary courts, but also at the Slovenian Constitutional Court. We very carefully dissect the vicious circles of Slovenian democracy, and also we address an issue which is very topical just in recent weeks in Slovenia, a topic of freedom of press in Slovenia. We are very critical as to the role of the fourth branch of government in being responsible for the current state of constitutional democracy in Slovenia. And then lastly, we also addressed what was a direct impact of the EU and also institutions of Council of Europe on the rule of law in Slovenia. And our main argument is that their impact has been substantial as to the formal rule of law, meaning as to the normative safeguard, normative frameworks on how constitutional democracy should function in a modern state. But we are quite reserved as to their impact in daily practice of Slovenian institutions, in daily practice of individuals who perform functions in the institutions of Slovenian state, but also in private sector. And we argue that those institutions have been weak and still remain weak, which make them very vulnerable to various arbitrary objectives. All in all, we also tell the often untold story of Slovenia as to the constitutional democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, beyond the usual suspects of Hungary and Poland. And we argue that crises of rule of law and democracy in Slovenia, in Central and Eastern Europe, have been plentiful, and that the rule of law and democracy have been often replaced by the rule by law and a term called democrature. It's a term called by a Slovenian writer, Drago Jančar. And also our critical investigation argues that those crises have perhaps a more deep and wide-ranging impact in Slovenia and other post-communist countries than only in Hungary and Poland, as is sometimes presented in academic and also policy literature. Our book contends that nouveau riche elites have often worked against application of constitutional democracy and rule of Slovenia and also elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. As to the question which Goras posed, how shall we reform? How is a reform possible of the state of art of constitutional democracy and rule of law in Slovenia? Well, our answer is that for the rule of law and democracy to stick, the mentality of elites has to be reformed. The mentality of elites across ideological spectrum has to change in order to internalize the values of constitutional democracy and rule of law. And we argue here that constitutional democracy and rule of law and human dignity are pre-constitutional concepts which cannot be subject to ideological interpretation, cannot be subjected to ideological protection of human rights and rule of law. And in this regard, our book hopefully makes a contribution to this academic discourse on the crises of rule of law and constitutional democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'll stop here, Goras, that we have more time for our commentators.
Of course. Thank you very much. Yerne, for this introduction, and also for bringing in, of course, the human right aspect. With this, as mentioned, we will give the floor to our, let's say, guests of today panel. And with this, I will give the floor to Professor Wojciech Sadurski. So, Professor, please just unmute yourself, and then please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Am I being heard? Okay, thank you. So first of all, my very, very big thanks to all three co-authors of the book and co-organizers of this meeting. It's both pleasure and honor. Of course, the pleasure would be much higher if we could all meet in Ljubljana, because I guess I would be offered a nice dinner after the event, but we'll need to postpone it for better times. Let me say that, and let me make it very clear right at the beginning, because later in my comment, just for the sake of stirring up discussion, I will make certain polemical points, but I need to say at the outright that it's a very formidable work. It's an incredibly solid, serious, in-depth, and at the same time impassionate effort. One of the best books in legal scholarship, and more specifically in comparative constitutional scholarship, that I've read for years. So I want to congratulate the authors. It's a terrific book. It's also, for me, whose knowledge of Slovenia has been extremely superficial, it was a real eye-opener. I think I'm a good example of this stereotypical person whom Matej imagines as thinking of Slovenia as an example of a successful post-communist democratization. So my view about Slovenia is very much along the lines of these stereotypes which Matej and Jerne describe and debunk. I've been thinking that Slovenia is an incredibly lucky country, that only by vagaries of geographical position it was part of what may be called this very tragic and unfortunate section of Europe, which we call Central Europe, but in fact it always belonged to the West, that it is country populated by very smart, well-educated people, that is very beautiful, and that it's well known, at least for one very famous eccentric philosopher. So for me, Slovenia was really a case of a lucky country. And I must say that I've read very carefully the entire book. I thought that I wouldn't have time to do it, but once I started, I couldn't really stop reading it. It's almost compulsive reading to become so disabused with all these stereotypes and cliches which I had in the first place. Well, let me say also at the very beginning that one aspect, one dimension of the book, which I fully and absolutely agree with, is what may be called European dimension. I think that here the authors are very, how should I say, measured and moderate. I agree basically with all the description and the normative dimension of the account that they give for the role of the Council of Europe and especially the European Union in first by the prospect of membership and then by membership itself, trying to affect the democratic consolidation and especially the rule of law in member states. I basically agree with everything they say. I may be even more sanguine actually about how I evaluate the impact of the conditionality upon consolidation of democracy and the rule of law. My view is more positive than theirs. But when it comes to listing several measures that the EU has at its disposal, including, preliminary reference and all the devices through the European Court of Justice, as well as Article 7, I'm here on the same page as the authors. Let me say, because I know that I don't have that much time for this initial statement, let me say where I had the biggest problem with the book. And that is obviously on something which Matej had already foreshadowed in his introduction, because it is, I take it, deliberately provocative thesis. And that is that Slovenia presents itself not just equal tragedy as Poland and Hungary face today, but actually something even worse. And apart from the introduction oral remarks by Matej, there are at least 3 points, three spaces in the book which I found when they make this point very emphatically. And in particular, I would like to point your attention to a sentence which I will quote from page 86, when they say, I quote, "One could argue that similar or worse events than the recent infringements of the rule of law in Hungary and Poland have been for years a well-established practice in Slovenia and elsewhere, where old arbitrary practices have been taken up by the post-communist transitional elites, which have translated them to all layers of the public and institutional life of the Slovenian state." Now, I've been thinking about comparing this statement to what is going on in Poland today. And when I say today, I don't mean these days, but literally today, 3rd June 2020. You have a number of still recalcitrant judges which are being ruthlessly harassed, persecuted, mobbed. Some of them, I know actually of 3 very, very strong, interesting persons who are at the brink of psychological depression. You have the Supreme Court, who has been, after various manipulations, captured by the executive and is now totally subordinate to the Minister of Justice as a result of largely illegal election of the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You have Constitutional Court, we call it Constitutional Tribunal, which has not just been paralyzed, that's the old story, which have been actually transformed into an active and enthusiastic helper of the executive. You have the parliamentary majority, which has been, since the beginning of COVID-19, manipulating the dates of the forthcoming presidential elections to make sure that it comes in the time when the incumbent president, a totally subservient person to the leader of the party, Mr. Duda, has the highest chances of election. You have so-called public media, which are not just biased, that's the case of public media probably all over the world, but which have been turned into a truly Goebbelsian, aggressive, violent, hateful propaganda machine for the government. And of course, you have all the power concentrated in the hands of one person who, formally speaking, has no responsibility, legally speaking, because he's just an MP, but he's the leader of the ruling party, Mr. Kaczynski. And now with these, and I could continue on, and that's what my recent book is about. I tried to, and things got only worse since the book appeared. And with this template in mind, I've been reading Matej's and Jernej's book. And I've been trying to see how does it compare. And when I finished the entire book, I I try to get the big picture. So where are all these crises? And I think, well, I wish for Poland to have a crisis like Slovenia has on any of these issues which you describe, because nothing comes close. Nothing from what you describe comes close to what is going on in Poland. And I'm not talking now about Hungary because we have Gabor on the panel. So since we will not disagree about facts, we take it that our accounts are accurate and honest, then the problem must be not in the descriptive dimension, but in this sort of concept or conception of democracy that we have. And I've been thinking, what sort of concept of democracy do you need to adopt to make a statement as at page 86, or at the end of your book, or at the beginning of your book, or in what Matej just said in the beginning, that Slovenia is not just as bad constitutional or democratic backsliding as Poland and Hungary, but actually is even worse. So I take everything that you say about relative unimportance, well, that's, I don't want to attribute it, not unimportance, but sort of partiality of the normative, as you call it, and I would call institutional aspect. So you identify things about political culture and about economic infrastructure. Political culture, low level of attachment to democratic principles, high degree of corruption, what we call dirty togetherness, which is a nice concept introduced by Professor Podgoretsky, all sorts of connections which are path dependent. Yeah, of course, you have it also in Italy. You have it in Greece. You have it in the United States. You have it all over the world. Of course, you may consider it, and you probably should, to be defects of democracy. But there are defects of democracy at the level, if you like, of political culture. And then you talk a lot about economy, and I acknowledge here Mr. Gorast's contribution here, because he authored this chapter, I understand. And it's very interesting too, and the interaction between economic structure and political democracy. But still, these are two different things, aren't they? I mean, it may well be that this sort of what you consider to be absence of economic pluralism affects and contaminates the political structure. But I would say probably not more than in the United States. And yet we, in itself, we don't take it as an independent, self-standing defect of democracy. So I have this, if you like, heuristic problem about understanding how, with all the anger that you have, and it's good to be angry when writing about democracy. I was very angry when I was writing my book about Poland, and I imagine Gabor is very angry when he writes about Hungary in his articles, and our anger does not prevent us from being accurate. So I appreciate, you have this debunking, critical aspiration, which is great, but we must have some proportions. And if you yourself invite this comparison, because you do it, you're just not saying, well, we are not interested in some standards under which Poland and Hungary are horrible. We are trying to find the common denominator. And I don't see them. And one of the ways of testing and verifying where is this common denominator that you have to condemn Slovenian democracy and the rule of law so harshly as to render it even worse than Poland, is to look at the very last section of your book, which is about your practical recommendations. And I think they are all extremely reasonable, but they are very modest. Okay, so we'll have corruption court here. Fine, you may have corruption court, you may have other bodies dealing with corruption. We'll have televised or broadcast meetings of the Council of Ministers. A nice idea, maybe. And then there are these things which are sort of very general. We'll have a Weberian civil service or public administration. Yeah, who would be against it? But in this sense, they just show that there is certain mismatch or certain disconnect between this so fundamental, so absolute, so unqualified condemnation of Slovenian democracy and the very specific measures which you propose to remedy. So this is my most fundamental issue. Let me just add two very small points, very, very briefly, 1 minute each, and then I'll stop. One is about path dependence, because it is your fundamental point, that much of the defects in Slovenian democracy and the rule of law goes back to the past, to what you call nicely at certain point, remnants of the past or pitfalls of the past or something like that. And then you see, look, there was never lustration in Slovenia. Well, there was lustration in GDR. You give actually example of professors in GDR who lost their jobs, etc. Well, one has to be very careful because lustration in itself carries all sorts of pathologies, as for example, Gabor has written, and I have written, and many other people have written. So somehow to say without being more critical, that the absence of lustration is such a great tragedy and so affects post-authoritarian government in itself is question begging. I mean, compare Czech Republic, which had lustration, with Slovakia, which didn't have. Or Czech Republic to Hungary. Or Spain, which never had lustration post-Franco. So these are very complicated issues, and I'm sort of surprised by this sort of very strong, harsh statement. No lustration, therefore we have simple replication of the bad old days today. And the last very minor thing, in your chapter 12, part 4, you talk about democratic and academic decay. There's something strange going on there, because you have the whole page, maybe more, about certain pathologies of the academic or scholarly constitutionalism in Slovenia, but also more generally in post-communist world. Not a single name there, not a single reference. There is reference to Matej's article in Verfassungsblog, so I checked it out. Not a single name either. So you write, you make a very fundamental condemnation of a certain group, certain category of scholars who are beneficiaries of the regime and who provide apology, constitutional apology for the regime. I know some of these people. I can think of some of these people. Not that many. I don't think it's a very big problem. But once you make this type of argument in a book which otherwise is so wonderfully, so impeccably referenced and sourced and provided with so many sources, to suddenly, treat all those people as some sort of anonymous being, it's a little bit like creating a person of straw, imagining a victim, a target of your critique without saying who he or she is, or for some reasons abstaining from mentioning the targets of your critique. And that's just not right. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sadowski. Thank you for bringing these outlines. I think my colleagues, Jerne and Matej, will have a lot to react after that. I myself will stick today to the, thank you also for bringing the economic chapter out, but today I will try to stick to my moderation role here. So maybe if at the end we'll have the time maybe for the debate, I will be very pleased to say also some things about it. But anyway, Professor Gabor Halmai, please, now the floor is yours for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation. And I'm not just saying this as a polite gesture, but as you saw in Wojciech's presentation, and you will hear my presentation, this kind of selection of commentators is really appreciated, because you could expect to hear our criticism, both from Wojciech and myself, because if you compare Slovenia with our countries, this reaction is almost obvious. Let me start with two disclaimers. One is that I'm not an expert in Slovenian constitutional law, in democratic theory, and I very much appreciate this book, because this is really something which hasn't been written in the last decades. The last book I read on Slovenian constitutional issues was on the Constitutional Court. So it's something really important and new on the market, and it's highly appreciated that you make this effort. My second disclaimer is that as you see, I do not belong to the same generation as Matej was talking about. So that means that I may have some different viewpoints as well. And I have two stories to tell myself, which are personal stories in the very beginning. One is a story from 1975. You see the other generation. When I was in the last year of my law school studies in Budapest, and we were invited to a labor camp, in the good sense of words, in old socialist times, to build the Belgrade-Bar train line. We worked very hard for 3 weeks for a 1-week holiday in Makarska. And one of my experiences was with having discussions of a lot of mostly Croatian, some Serbs in the camp, no Slovenians. And we were asking always about Slovenians. Why are Slovenians not here? And what is Slovenia is about? What is the uniqueness of Slovenia within Yugoslavia? And everyone unisono said, "Oh no, Slovenia is different. Slovenia is a capitalist country in '75. So you cannot compare Slovenia with all the other parts of the federation." So the other personal story is that since I live here in Florence and work here in Florence since 2016, every day at least once, sometimes twice, I drive through Slovenia back to Hungary. I always stop for overnight, sometimes in Ljubljana, sometimes in Maribor, sometimes in between. And my experiences are always the same, that Slovenia is still a very fine capitalist country. One point I told this story to Bojan, who kindly invited me for a sightseeing in Ljubljana. And he said, "Oh, be careful with this kind of statements that Slovenia is the so-called role model. We have a lot of problems here." Okay, so these are my personal stories when I started to read the book. And I start with the same issue Wojciech has started, probably not a big surprise, that actually this kind of comparison towards Poland and Hungary, and not just the comparison itself, the statement about the state of affairs in current Slovenia surprised me a lot. mainly because I had this stereotype as Wojciech had previously. But let me start with this assessment in the very beginning, in the first chapter of the book, which states that actually after 2008, after the financial crisis started, actually the U-turn, the end of the history started again. So, and the book is this first chapter is talking about the populist movement in form of constitutional backsliding, with the final object to create an illiberal state. So this is the very harsh statement, with the mentioned comparison that this is even worse than in Hungary and Poland. Before going into the chapters one by one, trying to challenge these statements of and the comparison, let me start with the very beginning about backsliding. I see my dear supervisee Julian Scholtes among the audience, and Julian was the ones who at a course at EUI rightly observed that actually backsliding is a very unuseful concept, because we do not know the agency behind the backsliding. Who is doing the backsliding? And here is my first issue. So when the book is talking about populists, about those who pursue an illiberal democracy, I cannot really detect who is the actors who are aiming at this turn of liberal democracy into an illiberal one. In some parts of the book, I see references to left liberal elite, which, as maybe Wojciech had the same feeling, is not identified. Who are those left liberals? And let me make a footnote to this label of left liberal as well, because it's very much used in Hungary as a kind of labeling the enemy, the left liberals. Let me say the first issue is that those left liberals, if they are at all one category, I doubt, by the way, they never attacked liberal democracy in Hungary. They may have been very, very unsuccessful, the socialist liberal governments in Hungary. They may have been corrupt as well, although that corruption cannot be compared with the mafia state of Viktor Orban, but they never attacked liberal democracy. So this kind of backsliding cannot be certainly identified with those left liberals. So I just wonder, I do not know the Slovenian circumstances, I just wonder, who are those people who you characterize as left liberal? And the second footnote, of course there are big differences between the left and the liberals. So if you talk about the history of the democratic transitions, those who were liberals, they were the enemies and they were the opponents of the communist regimes. While some of the left after the transition were the previous socialist or communist. So this kind of left liberal is also something which I cannot really identify with anyone else. So let me very quickly go through the chapters and asking whether this kind of comparison really can be detected in all those areas which are covered by the chapters. I was already talking about the first chapter, so the second chapter, which is about the genesis of the Slovenian constitutional democracy. Here, one of the theses of the chapter is that there is a discrepancy between ideals and actual practice of liberal democracy. So again, if you compare this with either with Hungary or with Poland, we cannot even talk about ideals of liberal democracy. So Viktor Orban, but also Jaroslav Kaczynski, or his court ideologists as Legutko or others, openly defy liberal democracy as an ideal. They are talking about illiberal or anti-liberal democracy. And of course, they are practicing illiberal non-democracy, but this goes too far. So probably so much about the chapter 2. Chapter 3, which is about the historical reasons for failure. And here I have to repeat what Wojciech has said about transitional justice. Again, transitional justice is a very, very controversial tool. You may remember that the previous peace government between 2005 and 2007 was aiming through lustration after 25 years of transition. And one of the opposition and one of the reasons for the failure of this government was this pursuit of having this kind of lustration. And here I see a contradiction within this chapter, which is on the one hand claiming that there have been no transitional justice, on the other hand is praising the Constitutional Court for its moderate practice on issues relating to cope with the past. So again, you have a Constitutional Court which you can praise about issues like dealing with the past or other issues. In Hungary or Poland, you do not have a Constitutional Court which can be considered as an independent checks of the government's power. So again, the comparison is very hard to make. Chapter 4 on the economic reforms, or rather the non-reforms of economy. So here the main subject of criticism is the gradualism. So I do not really see why gradualism is something which can be criticized. Of course, it can be criticized, and it can lead to a bad result of the economic policy. But is this a reason for backsliding or dismantlement of democracy? I don't think so. Chapter 5, the current crisis of human rights, rule of law, and democracy. The chapter actually claims openly that there is a formal normative architecture which has been established and very well established, the book claims. In Hungary and Poland, this entire formal normative architecture has been dismantled. So how you compare this formalist institutional structure with something which is totally dismantled? Chapter 6 about the judiciary. The main criticism, as I understand correctly, is the bad performance, the poor performance, and the fragility of independence and impartiality. Again, this kind of poor performance led the peace government to totally destroy the independence of the judiciary altogether. And the same applies to the Hungarian Constitutional Court and parts of the ordinary judiciary. So these are not comparable critiques or claims. And one more element to this, the chapter also acknowledges that maybe this poor performance of the judiciary is due to the flooded case law, that they are having a lot of cases they cannot deal with. By the way, this element is a little bit contradictory to the claim that there is no trust in the judiciary. So if there is no trust, why people are going to the courts every day and flooding the cases there. Chapter 7 about this vicious circle of Slovenian democracy. Again, the chapter claims that there is only a seeming democracy. In other words, a kind of window seeing a facade democracy. But in Hungary, there is no facade democracy at all. There are no free and fair elections anymore. So how can we compare the two situations? Not to speak about the new situation due to the coronavirus, when the Hungarian government introduced a rather dictatorial regime, and even though this most probably will be repealed, but will be replaced with an equally dangerous, constant kind of emergency power. How much time I have? Okay, very quickly, one sentence of each of the remaining chapters.
Yes, please.
8 about freedom of the press. There is a very strange claim that the Slovenian press seems to be like the British press in 1945, as George Orwell characterized the British press, being very centralized. I wish this characterization to the Hungarian press, which is non-existent as a free press. There is no free press whatsoever. Chapter 9, the welfare state. This is the most controversial in my view. So the chapter mainly claims that there is a welfare state and social economic rights protected in Slovenia. So then what's the point? In Hungary, there is a social Darwinism and no welfare state and no social economic rights. Not to speak about Poland, because there's a little bit different. Chapter 10, and here comes the two chapters, which is actually reflects to the title of the book. By the way, the title is a little bit misleading, because most of the book is about Slovenia and not about the influence of the European institutions. But here again, so chapter 10 is talking about the positive consequences of the Council of Europe institutions. There is no positive consequences of anything the Venice Commission or the European Court of Human Rights did in Hungary. Only the rejection, not even implementing the verdicts. And finally, not finally, chapter 11 about the EU. Again, so I hear again this post-communist left is mentioned as the one one agency which captured the state, and I do not see this capture really be proven. One sentence about the number of people who left the country. In Hungary, this is 10% of the people who left the country since the backsliding. And lastly, chapter 12. Again, this states that this is only a formal constitutional democracy. I wish a formal constitutional democracy, both for Poland and Hungary. So with those critics, thank you very much for your attention. Again, this is a great and important book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Halmai, for this, let's say, chapter by chapter review. I think especially Matej and Jerne will have a lot to add also afterwards. But let me give forward the floor to Professor Bugaric, to, let's say, to a Slovenian in UK, so that we'll see also that kind of perception. So, perception. Please, Professor Bugaric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matej, Jerne, for the invitation. I also read the entire book. I read it yesterday in one day, which is probably a good sign for the book, which means that when I started, I couldn't finish reading it. And I think the book does one very important thing, which is that it brings forward this previously unknown side of the Slovenian story, this problematic captured state, which was usually not represented in the scholarly accounts in the English-speaking world. So I remember my frustration when I was working on my different degrees in the West. I was looking for so-called alternative sources, different stories, and there wasn't much there around. Basically, the main story was the Slovenia as a success story, transition, more or less successful, few little problems here, few little problems there, but more or less a big success. And this book, I think, does a great favor, to the reality of Slovenia and tells the story, which is completely different, totally different. It tells the story of huge problems. It tells the story of how many basic legal institutions do not function as they're supposed to in a representative democracy. It tells the story of different violations of different constitutional principles, of different rights, and so on, so on. So I think this is a really, really important contribution, and it probably represents, because I haven't seen the book before in legal academia. Maybe there is one in political science. Unfortunately, we don't have. I don't know if we have any Slovenian political scientist among the audience. Maybe they can tell later, whether there's a similar account in political science or history, which tells this different narrative. So that's I applaud the authors for this, for their courage to tell this story. I think this is very important from the Slovenian context and also from the comparative context. I also like their emphasis on. It's very clear that they are, committed Democrats. They want. Basically, I would use the term, they want polyarchic democracy in the old Robert Dahl's terms. They want more, dispersed, decentered democracy with the many, centers of power, sharing the powers, allowing, the country to have more freedom, more space for citizens, for businesses, for everybody to operate within this country. And that's very clear. For example, I particularly like the chapters which were very empirical, full of details, full of even data, the names, like the chapter on the media, the chapter on courts, statistics, numbers, and so on. And you could clearly see, that the authors have a strong argument in order to support their own case. I could tell many my own stories, but I'm afraid they will take too much time. How I experienced the same things when I was still living in Slovenia. So I also really like if there is thought which reappears over and over and over again throughout the entire book is this discrepancy between the form and the substance. So if you look at the form, Slovenia is, doing surprisingly well. If you look at the substance, you see a completely different world. And I think this juxtaposition of these two different, visions of Slovenia offers a really fertile ground for further investigation into the details of Slovenian constitutional developments in the last 3 decades. I think I was very strongly made aware of that problem, surprisingly, by a very famous, now dead, Slovenian politician who was also the president of the first Slovenian parliament, France Bučar, who said in an interview not that long time ago, I mean, it's probably 5, 6 years or 7 years ago, he was invited to the national, public TV broadcaster, and he was asked, he was relatively old, he was a very influential, he he was considered as to be a the founding father of the Slovenian constitution and so on, and he said to the audience that he thinks that the basic problem Slovenia is that we basically still live and think like in the communist times. What did he mean exactly? I think he meant something similar to what Matej and Jernej are trying to tell, which is that the structure, if you come from from the outside world, if you look just at the structure, if you look at the legislation, if you look at the constitution, if you look at most of the things, looks pretty much something was borrowed from Germany, something from Austria, something from other parts of the world, so it looks pretty well. But the substance still functions pretty much, I wouldn't say entirely, but pretty much like in the old, communist times. So what did he mean by that? He meant that people did not, and that's another connection between his thinking and what I found also in Matej, Jernej, and Gora's book. They also very frequently refer to the word internalization. So the democracy has not been internalized. So it's there out, but it's people, there are many norms, democratic norms, but there aren't enough Democrats in Slovenia. That's another important message. And also I want to bring this forward as another important contribution of all 3 authors to this debate. So I think these are so far so good. So these are all very good points, and then many more. And there are also many points where I strongly disagree, but I think they are less important than the points where I agree with them. So I want today to speak mostly about the points where I agree with the authors, because those where I disagree, can be dealt in a separate conversation. By coming back to my first point and saying that the book opens a very new, productive floor for further investigation of position of Slovenia in the context of Central Eastern European politics, I mean that now, after this book, it won't be possible to talk anymore about, only about Slovenia as a success story. So all people, each author will try to write about this story will have to take into account, all the chapters, all the stories which are, told in this particular book. Then, having said that, I would also like to, because so much have been already said by Wojciech and Gabor, so I don't want to spend too much time here to repeat what I said, but I also, of course, have to say that I found troubling this comparison. It not only because, I don't come from Hungary, I don't come from Poland, I haven't been there, but I'm following developments in Hungary for the last 8-9 years. I'm following developments in Poland for the last 5-6 years. And I'm following developments in the entire region for the last decade. And I think that all of us, we all have fundamental problem here, which is that because Poland and Hungary are the worst cases, we use them as some kind of a yardstick, as a measurement. And then we try to compare all other countries to Poland and Hungary. And sometimes we say, oh, that case is so different or is so similar. I think the reality is much more complex. So by saying that, I would, urge authors also to use the existing study for further, more empirical exploration of the Slovenian case in this empirical, because there are already very serious, important studies out, mostly by political scientists, who actually criticize this notion of backsliding. There are two British authors, both political scientists. They publish widely, and they criticize the idea of basically saying that the entire region is now going back to some kind of authoritarian past. No, we have to be careful. We have to look into particular details of different cases and say what is specific about which particular case. So in that respect, I think, and I wouldn't say more here because I think that I agree with Gabor and Wojciech that to say that Slovenia and that Slovenia is worse than Hungary and Poland is of course not only exaggeration. It's not supported by a real empirical evidence in the book because there isn't empirical evidence there for this kind of sort of evaluation. But even if I say that, I think the book opens possibility for a different analysis of Slovenia, and I think that's where probably we agree with the author. Slovenia is a pretty different, unique case, because the nature of the state capture and of most of the problems that the authors described in the book, has been going on, for a long period of time, and it's quite different from many other countries that I've been following in the last 10 years or so. That's why I would like to urge the authors to take into account the specificity of the situation and try to come up with the follow-up stories which would substantiate the arguments that they're making in the book and try to show how and why Slovenia is different from other stories. So I think that would be the most productive line. If they think that there is a reason to compare Slovenia with Hungary, then of course they would need to provide much more empirical data and evidence in order to support such claims. How much time do I have more?
So
last minute.
Couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay, I'll be short. Yeah, to conclude, it's a pity, and I would not want to make too much of this point, but I think I would like to return back to the quality of the book, which is a good account of how specific, how different situation in Slovenia is, and I would like to single out again the chapters which use a lot of data, a lot of information, a lot of empiricism, and they were those most convinced me about, particularly again about the judiciary, about the media, were the really two for me the most convincing chapters. As to this agreement, again, I would rather not, venture into it, because for those of you who are not Slovenians, this is, if we start to talk about that, then we would need, the entire day just to, come out with or different opinions about that. So, to conclude, congratulations on the new book, and I look forward for a new research based on your major arguments of your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bugaric, for your, let's say, reaction to the book. Now we have accumulated quite some time, so we have some half an hour to finish our, let's say, academic forum for today. So I just urge our speakers that I will be much more stricter now in the last half an hour. I suggest we go now to the reactions from the authors. So maybe Matej, will you start, please?
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful for all these comments. I knew that, if you're trained in this academic world, you always know that after a big praise, also criticism comes. And that's the kind of criticism that we received today. It's only something we could have wished for. So I'm really grateful for it. So I maybe make 2 or 3 points. One would relate to this provocative hypothesis, which is deliberately provocative. It's provocative in order to make a case for a story to begin with. Another point would be about something that Wojciech touched upon. Then Bojan also referred to it. Wojciech didn't really elaborate it after, eventually. It's about the conception of democracy that we are actually drawing on. And thirdly, I might also say something about the language and its harshness and naming and blaming and labeling different groups of people. So about the comparison and about the claim of being worse or equal, or how you take it, it is a provocation, and and it is also not my intent here to venture in this kind of a competition. Who is in fact in the real world out there worse? Who is a bigger perpetrator? Who is suffering more? I mean, we're always suffering most in our own political communities, which things are where the actual things are happening to us. So this kind of anger, as Wojciech described it, it might be also understood from that perspective. So I'd rather dwell here on the language of Bojan, on the language of specificity of Slovenia. And I think it is in this specificity that there are certain elements that make Slovenia actually worse than other countries. And the argument, it will sound blunt, and we can discuss it elsewhere in another fora or whether there's an opportunity, but there is an underlying rationale in this book, supported by the actual situation out there, that to a certain extent, what the autocratic regimes in Hungary and Poland are doing now, or have been doing over the last 10 years, it is not necessary to be done in Slovenia. Why? Because the situation has always been like that. Certain influential group, certain political spectrum has always had its own loyalists in place. And it has had their loyalists in the Constitutional Court, and they have their loyalists in Constitutional Court, on the central bank, in diverse inspection mechanisms, etc., on the national TV. But so there is no one to be blamed to appoint these people, because they have always been there, and they are presented here as something which is normal. Also, speaking about the courts, in Slovenia too, we have 1 or 2 judges that are harassed, that are put in front of all sorts of ethical commission. There is no need to harass others, because those others already know how to behave in order to be on the safe side. And there has been very little pressure over the last 20 years to do anything in that field to change that situation, because that situation suits the monopolistic forces that, through their economic mechanisms, control this country. So what I'm saying is that, to a certain extent, measures in Slovenia are not even necessary, because they can be achieved in an informal way under the guise of impeccable formality, or you do not need to use this kind of baton that one has to use in Hungary and in Poland in order to further your own political and power interests. That's the argument that I'm making about the worseness of the situation. But of course, we can always conclude that we agree to disagree, and there much depends also on the facts and the kind of normative glasses that we are wearing as we are approaching those facts. Now, quickly about the conception of democracy. Bojan has already referred to the kind of polyarchy conception of democracy. We are arguing in favor of constitutional democracy, which is perforce a liberal democracy, because it begins with the protection of the freedom of an individual. And the essence of the liberal constitutional democracy is to allow individuals to flourish, to have their life, to lead their lives of self-fulfillment, and to have the state, the institutions of the state, in being instrumental to this constitutional goal. So if we proceed from this premise that everything boils down to the freedom of the individual, responsible freedom of the individual, that is in relation to other individuals, then the essence of constitutional democracy is plurality and the respect for it, which makes a constitutional democracy a system based on pluralism. So pluralism is a quintessential for constitutional democracy, and constitutional democracy is there to defend this pluralism. In more institutional terms, then this translates into checks and balances and all these things that we actually know. So the argument about economy and where this book to a certain extent goes Marxist is that since in Slovenia we had a special kind of economic transition that left basically the former collective ownership, state ownership, in the hands of the powerful formal elites, both informal and formal, in the government and in all those para-state institutions. This has actually created an economic monopoly that has stifled the development of all other types of pluralism that one requires to have in a constitutional democracy. If you have this kind of a monopoly over economy, which is state or para-state owned, that is by certain groups that are always close to the government in power and that are effectively putting this government in power through their media, this means that you cannot develop a pluralistic civil society, you cannot develop a pluralistic and therefore free and independent media, you cannot develop a pluralistic and free educational system, you cannot have a plurality of universities, etc., etc., etc. For example, in Slovenia, in comparison to Hungary, there is no need to close down a private university. Why not? Because everything is being done not even to establish one, to put it on the end. So finally, in terms of the language, I haven't been naming concrete personas, pointing fingers to particular scholars or, I don't know, politicians or whatsoever, because the way I wanted to do it, we wanted to write about phenomena. And also for me, personally, Viktor Orban is not just Viktor Orban is a person, he is a phenomenon. He's a phenomenon of populist authoritarianism, which is, in that specific situation, right-wing authoritarianism. But this phenomenon can be also of a left-wing authoritarianism, only it's not named Orban, but it might be someone else standing for the same kind of a phenomenon. And finally, about the liberals, left liberals, right liberals, conservatives, here we have a problem of language, here we have a problem of translation between different communities, between different states in Europe. We have a problem of our own ideological lenses. So being aware of those problems, I have deliberately used in my own chapters the language of a post-communist left and of a post-communist right. Because I'm claiming that 30 years on after the transition, in Slovenia, we still do not have a left properly so-called and the right properly so-called, not to speak about the center. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Matej. I will give the floor now to Jernej to give his remarks. I would just like to point out to the speakers that there are already some questions in the group chat, so you can look at them, and maybe when we will give the floor later on, you can maybe reply to also some of them. But Jernej, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind words, and also for criticism. In a way, I mean, we expected your criticism as to the main arguments of the book. We, as you know, we discussed with you some of the chapters at the conferences, at the workshops here in Slovenia, and also elsewhere. We had many prior debates with also with Bojan. So we know how your take is on crises of Christian democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. But nonetheless, we argue, and also in my chapter, I argue that the main hurdle to living constitutional democracy in rural Slovenia is that the constitutional values of dignity, pluralism, freedom, and equality have not been internalized. And in this way, one can compare the situation in Slovenia to other national contexts across Central and Eastern Europe, and also Hungarian and Polish context. Perhaps you may be right that the measures are not that drastic, are not that direct as we can follow in the last 10 years from those two national contexts. But in the context, in the content, we can witness in Slovenia examples of state capture, of deep state, of informal networks of elites which are controlling institutions of a rule of state, from judiciary, legislative branch and executive branch, to also controlling through state-owned enterprises, private economy in Slovenia. So there is definitely empirical evidence of authoritarian legacy in Slovenia, and often we witness in every area of society in Slovenia that this authoritarian legacy, and I also call it in Slovenia post-communist legacy, or even I use the term post-communist nouvelle riche elites, which are controlling universities, institutions in Slovenia, but also private sectors. And examples are as drastic as from Poland and Hungary. If Orban closes down Slovenia, we have just now attempts to close down new university in Slovenia by the Ministry of Education and Slovenian agency on the higher education. We have examples of prosecution of human rights defendants, people who are arguing for the right to life of unborn babies. We have examples of persecution of judges, which highlighted arbitrary practices within the Slovenian judiciary, and though the same judges were then prosecuted by ethical committees and judiciary council of Slovenia. So the context, the content, the substance which we present in our book exemplifies also empirically. Here I disagree with all of you that also empirically that Slovenia's example of state capture, state of weak institutions, or very weak rule of law, where even human rights protection is subject to the ideology. And here I can tell you one story. When I started my my studies, law studies at the state law school in Ljubljana, and we had one of the first classes was a class on constitutional law, and a professor who was teaching at that time was teaching also about constitutional principles in human rights. And only later in my studies I found out, for example, what the Slovenian or the predecessor of Slovenian state did in May or June 1945, where the predecessor of the Slovenian state, the former Yugoslav Communist Party, executed over 50,000 people on the Slovenian territory, and nobody was prosecuted in this regard. Also in democratic, independent Slovenia. So perhaps our critique also of, in a way, of academia in Slovenia, is justified. And we didn't want to, Wojciech, we didn't want to mention individuals and persons, because our book was written ad rem, and also myself in my public discourse I avoid ad personam discourse. I avoid being subjective towards particular individuals, but just highlighting the pattern of the rule of law and democracy problems. Perhaps only one comment more, Goraz, that I won't be too long. As to the chapter 9, which is on the welfare state. I think Gabor mentioned one criticism as to this chapter. I guess I would say this chapter is very important to the book, because often in Slovenia ourselves, but also public and ordinary persons, we often complain why Slovenia is not on par with Austria, Germany, and Nordic countries as to the economic development. And if you look closely into the comparative economy, one of the arguments why countries are differently developed economically is also that institutions are weak, that the rule of law is weak, that public life is hijacked by dirty togetherness and authoritarian legacy. So basically, if I summarize, our book is a contribution again to this discourse to Central and Eastern European backsliding, with a specific, as Bojan mentioned, of particular Slovenian situation. In Slovenia, we didn't have anything to slide back to, because the situation in Slovenia since the independence is that of only formal constitutional democracy, and there is a lack of really substantive rule of law. There is a lack of real commitment to the values of constitutional democracy by people who hold positions within the Slovenian institution, but also in private sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerne. Yes, now I will have to be very authoritarian. If you agree or do not agree, I will give the floor to each of our guest speakers for 5 minutes, and I will be very strict on this, and then for the end I will also give the floor to Matej and Jerne to give the final remarks. Anyway, I would like to point out we have 3 questions in the chat room from our guests. You can read them there, and maybe also in your reactions reply in that sense. Otherwise, I will at the end also read them out. But maybe for your replies, I would first go to Professor Sadurski to maybe give his remark as the first one, and then Professor Halma, and then Professor Bugaric. Okay, please.
No, I really don't want to. I don't want to respond either to Matej and Jerne. I think they have a right to have the last word for the time being. So if I may use my privilege of speaking, I would like to address the first question by Mr. Peter Kamnisar, which I see here.
Yes.
The first question is, what are top 2-3 signs of constitutional backsliding that we need to pay attention to? And of course, it is a very sensitive matter. I mean, in different countries, you have different situations and different targets of the authoritarians. But there are certain things which are reasonably universal. And if I may universalize or generalize from the Polish example, I would say there are 3 main items to look at. And they are judges, media, and self-government. So when it comes to judges, and by that I mean both constitutional judges and regular judges, they are normally the first target of various ways of capture by the government. Sometimes they may seem very innocuous, certain slight changes in the composition of the top bodies of the Supreme Court or Constitutional Court. Sometimes they may go much more deeply, such as the changes in the composition of the National Judicial Council, National Council of Judiciary, whatever you call it, in a way as to make, for example, the parliamentary majority, i.e. the leadership of the ruling party, more influential in selecting its members and therefore in appointing and dismissing judges. But normally, whenever you realize that the position of judiciary becomes more dependent on the executive, less resilient, more manipulable, then this is probably the first sign, the first warning sign, the most typical for constitutional backsliding. The second is about media, both public media and private media. It may be mainly about the ownership, as in Hungary, where basically you don't need to introduce censorship, you just introduce new rules of the ownership and make sure that all the oligarchs owning the media are totally dependent on and faithful to the political leadership. It may be about public media, where public media are eroded of any semblance of independence, impartiality, neutrality, and are subjected to the government. And the third one is about self-government, local self-government. So we have this situation that in the authoritarian populist countries, you have almost paradoxical case of great cities, including capital cities, being controlled by anti-authoritarian leaders. There's the case of Budapest, there's the case of Istanbul, that's the case of Warsaw. So the government will typically try to, if they cannot win over those positions, to erode the powers of self-government, financially, legally, etc. So that, okay, so they may be controlled by Democrats, but we will reduce their powers. Now, there are many other signs, but I would say these three signs are a good sort of test for constitutional backsliding, and usually they come in certain configuration. They do not come separately, but together. There are many other things, of course. They may be about electoral commissions, they may be about anti-corruption, they may be about state-owned enterprises, but I would say the three I mentioned are a good point to start with. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Sadurski, for answering the first question which we have from the participants. And Professor Halmai, please, the floor is yours. You can use your 5 minutes as you wish, whether answer any question, whether reply to anything, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The problem is that I do not see the questions. They disappeared. I have seen one question earlier, and I tried to react to that, which is also a reaction to Matej's reply. And this is, the question is the role of the government. Because as Matej's answer seemed to indicate that all these elites, being left, liberal or others, which actually occupy the political space and also occupy the government, as I understood the response given by Matej. So here comes my question. So then what is the difference between the different governments which have changed in the last years, even very recently? The Janša government came back, which is considered as a rather right-wing populist government, by the way, very, very close to Orban's idea about the state structure. So what is the role of those changing governments? Because in your explanation, it seems to me that whoever is in the government, they just follow the intentions and the commands of this left liberal or whatever kind of elite. So does it make any difference if you have a right or a left-wing government? And finally, one question which I did not want to ask you, but since we are talking about the future as well, chapter 12. So there was a strange claim here, and I just want to understand the proposal, which states that state authorities should intensify their efforts against state capture. So how do you envisage this kind of change initiated by the state authorities themselves, who are already captured. So this seems to be a kind of catch of Baron Münchhausen trying to pull himself out from his hair. So how do you see this? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Halmai. And as said, Professor Bugaric, the floor is yours.
There's so many people in the room, so I'm ready to give up my minutes and to give more space to the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so there are quite now some questions in the chat room. As you can see, some of them are quite long, so it would be relatively hard for me to read them all out. But if so, then I would, of course, as said, give the floor also to Matej and Jerne. They both have 2 minutes each. And then we'll see, maybe during this you can also read the questions if you can reply to them. Otherwise, we will maybe give a short couple of minutes chance for the audience, for the people in the chat, in the room, in the Zoom room. But anyway, Matej, please, 2 minutes to give some feedback and maybe some of the answers to the questions.
Fantastic, thank you. I've just encountered a question by Jaka. Thanks, Jaka, for the question. I think there is an upper premise. I also tried to explain it in my short response to Wojciech, but the kind of ideal situation that we are imagining and against which we are then measuring the specific situation, actual state of affairs in Slovenia, is the notion of constitutional democracy, as developed by Habermas. It's also present in the work of Ronald Dworkin, and ideologically all this is resting also on the theories of John Rawls, the idea of political liberalism. So that is where I'm coming from, and from the also from the values that different courts, including the Slovenian Constitutional Court, the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, have extrapolated them how they should look like in practice. In terms of the changes in government, and in terms of the change in the recent change involving the Janša government, well, as we explain in the book, if you want to stay faithful to this ideal, or some might even argue, or idealized notion of constitutional democracy, a kind of constitutional democracy heaven on earth, then basically you yourself as an individual in Slovenia who wants to be serious about these ideals, more or less find yourself constantly between a rock and a hard place, no matter who is actually in power. Because the post-communist left, who has been in power for the greatest period of time, other than, I think, 7 years, has used its the state and all other instruments in its own governing favor. It has given feuds to its own loyalists. But of course, when a new government comes into power, its own self-preservation instincts drive it into the same direction. So it wants to award its own loyalists, just replicating the system but this time from the other ideological perspective. So sometimes I write publicly in Slovenia that in terms of Janša, who is now, as he has publicly declared himself to be Orban's ally, even though his powers way cannot match what Orban has in Hungary, so the comparison in that sense cannot be really quantitatively made. But in terms of this situation, I find it ridiculous that the left-wing Orbanism that we now have, somebody would like to exchange for a right-wing Orbanism. So for a Democrat, for somebody who feels passionate about these ideal concepts, it is that you find yourself on the margins of the public debate. And in terms, I think, yeah, in that sense, I think I've almost answered my questions. And let me finish in a way with an overarching question that I think hangs above this project that all of us here have basically been involved with. I think the question for Central and Eastern Europe is how to create out of these historically deeply illiberal societies of Central and Eastern Europe that have been so much pathologized through history with all different kinds of authoritarian regimes and totalitarian systems, how to mold out of this social structure a constitutional democracy, properly so called. And in that sense, Gabor, you are absolutely right. We can count only on those that we currently have. And in that sense, we are like Baron von Munchausen, who has to save himself from the quicksand by pulling himself after his hair. Because first of all, we need robust institutions that will do what is the right thing to be done. We need a critical mass of people who will stand for those ideals and not to look away and not to shy away when their opportunity comes to be loyal and to get their own feuds. I think that is actually a social ethical imperative, and eventually I think constitutional democracy boils down to the individuals and their integrity or a lack thereof. You cannot have a democracy without Democrats, and I think that's a problem that we are witnessing, in particular in this part of Europe, but gradually also all over the place, all over the world, because other systems are more attractive in their utilitarian produces that they produce for the individuals.
Okay, thank you very much, Matej. Now I would give the floor to Jernej. Maybe just to react, I think we answered to the majority of questions. I think we left there. We still are missing the one which is asking about what goal we need to pursue in terms of the constitutional progress. So maybe what about a little bit, because we are slowly finishing. So maybe Jernej, if you try to also integrate also some visionary, some future, what is there to be done in the future in order to be better. So please, the floor is yours, Jernej.
All right, I think the main question, I mean, for all of us is, and here I'm also answering to Matthias and Jaka's question, is how we conceive constitutional democracy and the rule of law and the values of constitutional democracy, such as human dignity, pluralism, equality, freedom, solidarity. And throughout the book, now we, through dissecting Slovenian situation, we ask the question whether those values and those concepts are ideological concepts. No, whether can we define and can we interpret those concepts as depending on each of our own ideology. No? And our main argument in the book is that if we want to be faithful to the concept of constitutional democracy and rule of law, we have to agree that those concepts are beyond ideology. No? They are pre-constitutional democracy which have to be complied by any government. No, either from right or left part of the spectrum. In this way, of course, our book is very critical of the current state of the art of Slovenia, which, if you want to be fair, is under the influence of the post-communist elites in Slovenia so far. Out of almost 30 years since the democratization and independence, only about, if I'm not mistaken, 6 of those years we had the center-right parties or mixed coalition parties in the government. So of course our book is very much critical against the institutional but also societal elites in Slovenia, which are very much connected to the post-communist left, not only to the post-communist left, also to the mentality post-communist left, to the monopoly in education, media, and so on, created in the Slovenian society. What's next? How to move forward? Well, to move forward is to be faithful to this pre-constitutional values of human dignity, pluralism, equality, and the rule of law, and that we strictly insist on application of this concept in daily life of not only Slovenia but beyond Central and Eastern Europe. As we know, institutions in our region are super weak, or they are non-existent, and they very much depend on people. No, they depend on us to uphold those values in our daily lives, either in private sector or in public sector.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerne, for this comment and also providing some answers to this final question. If there are maybe any questions, but otherwise we have only 3 more minutes. So if I would maybe relate to the last issue of The Economist, I think they had a whole section about the Zoom generation. So if we are probably, since we're using this software now, so we could be probably also defined as the Zoom generation. There was also that a section that around all these meetings and video conference should end approximately in 1 hour. After that, usually the focus usually falls very much. We have now been discussing for almost 2 hours, so we're 2 minutes until 2 hours, and I think the discussion has been very fruitful, has been very interesting. I think the debate also in the chat has really now turned on. But anyway, in my capacity as the moderator, I think I would at this point maybe finish our academic forum for today. I would really like to thank all our guest speakers from abroad that have joined us. I would like to thank, of course, Jerne and Matej for actually providing the idea of the book and the academic forum which we are having today. And of course, for almost 40 participants that were today together here in this conference room with us. Once more, I would really like to thank all of you for your participation, for your time, and for your valuable comments, and of course, valuable time which you have provided to us. That will be from my side. Really thank you to everyone, and with this we can, I think, conclude this academic forum of the new university for today. I see a lot of thank yous are coming through the chat room. So thank you to everyone, and I hope to see you in live in autumn somewhere in Ljubljana, as many times discussed. Thank you.
Thank you.